Hi, Robin, and welcome to my little YouTube series, Ask the Experts. You're the very first guest on my YouTube channel here, my YouTube series, where people get a chance to ask questions for the experts in various areas. Today's topic is trauma, and especially how to work with trauma in an ACT consistent way. And Robin, I've known you for many, many years. You are also one of the presenters or co-host of our little retreat, ACT retreat on Zanzibar that we're doing in January. So I've known you for a long time, but for those in the audience who might not know you, I'm just going to do a short introduction. In the ACT community, you are often referred to as the trainer's trainer, and you've been working with ACT for many, many years, and you'll tell it later. And when I was preparing for today, I looked through your resume, and it's quite extensive. So I had to kind of like condensate it to the most essentials. But besides, you have been working with the ACT for many years. You have been, you are assistant professor at the University of Berkeley and working for the National Center for PTSD. Is that correct? Yeah. And you have also written 9 books on ACT. 3 of them is like working with ACT and trauma. And most recently, you published a self-help book uh, about working with your trauma. The title is You Are Not Your Trauma, correct as well?
Yep.
Yeah. So I think it would be fair to say that you're kind of like one of the leading experts in the field of ACT and trauma. So happy to have you here. Anything I forgot, anything that also should be mentioned or anything that might be relevant for our
No,
viewers to
thank
know
you
as well?
for the kind introduction and happy to be here and happy to be the first one on your new YouTube series.
Yeah, perfect. We had a lot of questions for the interview today. We won't have time to go through all of them, but to see if I can get as many in as possible. But Robin, before we go into the questions, tell me a little bit about your journey into ACT. How did you become interested in ACT? And perhaps also your interest in trauma. Where does that stem from?
Yes, so let's see. I started working on trauma before I got interested in ACT. So way back when I did my master's degree, I looked at different aspects of and impact of childhood sexual trauma. And then I applied to University of Nevada, Reno, where there was a professor working on trauma. So my plan was to go up there and do my PhD in the area of trauma. Of course, that's where Steve Hayes was, the developer of ACT. And the first month we were there, he held a workshop for all the students, an ACT workshop. And it was a life changer for me. I fell in love almost instantly with the model. I found it personally impactful. I have a trauma history myself, which may have been part of my decision to work on trauma. Not fully, but I think it probably played a role. And that work that I did in the workshop with Steve was incredible. I really had a 180-degree turn on my relationship with myself. And so I started working with Steve too. I straddled 2 labs for many years and started combining ACT and trauma in graduate school. So it's been quite some time now.
Sounds like an incredible experience. Um, and you also said that you kind of like have a personal connection to trauma and probably where your interest comes from. Would you mind sharing just a little bit of that with us? It might be helpful for people listening who might be able to connect to some of your experiences.
Yeah, no, I grew up in a family with a father who I'm not exactly sure entirely what was going on for him, but he had a lot of control issues, and he was domestically violent, both towards my mother and towards us kids, and really created a lot of challenges in our family. And my mother divorced him when I was about 14. And so for both my older brother and I, it was a significant number of years where we were exposed to the impact of domestic violence. And so quite unfortunate for us as a family, and freeing when my mom finally decided to go. And so I've always been interested in assisting women who are often the targets of trauma, unfortunately.
Well, thank you for sharing your story. Sorry that you had to go through all of that, but also you kind of like sit here today as a beacon of hope that even though that you go through something like that, you still manage to kind of like get over it at one point. And I know if I know you very well, at one point we're probably going to talking a little bit about like we are not our trauma, or you're not your trauma.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And in your in your opinion, what do you think is that ACT offers when working with clients who has experienced trauma? What is that the ACT model provides? And also like that might be in your opinion, that might be unique compared to other therapies.
I think there are two key things. I mean, there are other things that ACT provides, but when I think about the two, like, very specific to ACT that I do not see in other treatments, which, I'm trained in prolonged exposure, cognitive processing therapy. I have some training in EMDR and accelerated resolution therapy. I'm trained in written exposure therapy. So I have a broad background in all many of the different therapies that are used to treat trauma, and none of them address personal meaning or values. And so ACT is really interested in helping people orient towards what really matters to them and what's meaningful. And so that clearly had an impact on me personally, is that it made sense that I didn't want to be caught in the past, and I wanted to orient as I moved forward in life towards things that were important and that mattered to me. And I'm hoping that the work we that I do in trauma, and that others who work with acting trauma, can help survivors turn towards those kinds of outcomes rather than just looking in the rearview mirror all the time about what was. And then the other thing that I think is really fabulous, and part of why we called the book, Dara is my co-author, Dara Westrup, why we called the book You Are Not Your Trauma, is that we are much more than our history or our memories and the things that happened to us. And so inside of the work around self as context or self as experiencer, you come to, with the work in ACT, you come to discover that you are a place where memories occur, or sensations, or emotions and thoughts. You are not those themselves. And so you make room for your past experiences, but they are not by any means the definer of who you are in your life. And I think those two things can really be freeing for survivors and help them move forward in their life. And I do not see them in other treatments.
That's very interesting and also resonates with me. Like one of the things that I was drawn to ACT, I like the values part. I like that it's not just about like getting people underneath a certain cutoff score and then they're treated. It's more like, okay, so also like, of course, we need to make sure that you are not your trauma, but also how do you actually create a life worth living with with your history, both good and bad.
Agreed.
What do what do you find is the trickiest part of working with trauma? And perhaps also you also supervise a lot of therapists. and you've been working a lot with ACT therapists. So both like if you could talk a little bit about what do you find is challenging, tricky working with trauma, but also in what do you experience that therapists normally struggle with working with trauma?
Yeah. So I think one of the hard parts in working with trauma is for the client is that we're often inviting them to revisit and process uh, very painful memories. And so I always feel a little hesitance around it, but it's only an internal experience because I know that this work can help them heal. And so that I think is a little challenging because you often have to get into some of the traumas in detail and really help people work through something that is hard to talk about. And you see a lot of emotion in the room. And so, you're carrying a lot when you're working with clients who are making their way through these events. Um, so that I think I see the difficulty in the client, right? And that those are challenging, but absolutely worthwhile in the long run, right? It is part of the healing process. And then for clinicians, I suppose there's two things that can be challenging. And one is fear of doing that processing. So therapists are afraid that they're going to re-traumatize their clients and that it's going to be a terrible thing. And really what we probably need to change the languaging around that a bit, because we're not re-traumatizing our clients. Like, you're not again abusing your client, or in the war with the client or whatever it is that you're working on. You might be evoking symptoms, and the symptoms can get worse as you begin the process, but some of that is expected. If they're contacting the experiences and not avoiding, you might see those experiences grow a bit, but the idea is to work through them, not to avoid them because you're worried about re-traumatizing. So I'll see therapists who are hesitant or don't want to do it. Now, I do think it's wise for therapists who are working with trauma to be trauma informed and to understand how to help clients work through an increase in experiencing that might be labeled as negative. So, I want to be careful about that. And then the second thing is that if you're working with trauma and you have 3 or 4 trauma survivors on your caseload in a day, it's a lot to hold in terms of the amount of traumatic experience that you're hearing as a therapist. And it's inevitable that when the client is describing to you what happened, that you as the therapist will get images of it, and not that they match what's going on for the client, right? But you'll form your own images, and carrying that is can be heartbreaking. And so ACT has been really helpful for me as a therapist because I'm not their trauma either, right? And so I can hold their memory in whatever way I experience it, and stay present in the room with the client as they're working through what happened.
It's interesting that you say that about like re-trauma, that is perhaps not really a thing or something we should be aware of, because I know this because you have taught me this. I see it a lot of like therapists, they are curious about it, but I actually also see it in clients. I had a client recently where we worked with like trauma and we worked with exposure, and she was very hesitant to kind of like go into the exposure because she was afraid like is all this gonna get worse? And she also read that re-trauma could be a thing.
Yeah.
And then we could actually talk about saying it's not really a thing. I mean, I'll make sure that you are in control, but it's kind of like expected that you will experience stuff and that you will have an arousal when we do all of this. And it's completely normal. And then like that's especially where I really prefer creative hopelessness, because you can actually talk about what has it cost you not or to avoid the trauma. and that can be really helpful. Um, but actually, what you're already talking about actually brings us into like two questions
Uh-huh.
that we had a lot of questions for today, so we won't have time to get through all of them. But one question that we got was like how to work with creative hopelessness in trauma victims or traumatized clients. That can be very challenging for many therapists. If you could talk a little bit about how you do it or any advice on how to do it.
Sure. So one thing is to understand what it is, and that this is where people struggle, right? Because the name of this work, creative hopelessness, clinicians are like, what do you mean hopelessness? And then they can misunderstand what's happening. And so creative hopelessness is about undermining control. And if you look at post-traumatic stress disorder, like the majority of what's going on there is avoidance. It's about trying to control through avoidance your internal experience, not feeling the fear, not having the images, not experiencing some of the sensations. Understandably so, right? I mean, these things can be distressing, and it can feel like something's happening again. And that's why that word re-traumatization shows up in there. But the trauma isn't actually happening again. And I think we just need to find a different way to talk about that, because it implies something that's not happening. So that worries me when we think about our relationship with clients, right? And clients' relationship with us. So I think when I'm doing creative hopelessness is when I'm holding, this is about undermining the avoidance that's causing problematic and challenging ways for this individual to live, where they've completely shrunk their lives and they're, not inside of a meaningful experience in terms of what they care about, what they matter about. Then you can see why I'm doing this. Like it has a function and a purpose. It's not about making the client feel hopeless. And clients can feel all kinds of things. I did groups at the National Center for PTSD using ACT for years, and with veterans with post-war trauma. And the majority of the time, what people felt when we did creative hopelessness was relief, not hopeless. Like, oh, I just thought I was bad at this thing. And now you're telling me it doesn't work or it can't work for the world inside the skin. And so lots of things can come out of creative hopelessness. The hopelessness is about the control agenda, not about the human being. I have hope for my clients. It's the agenda of internal control that's the problem. So getting really clear around that and understanding what it's about can be helpful. And then, bring your presence, bring your compassion, validate the desire to control or why they want to control. It makes sense. They've been taught to control. So when you're doing the work, you can, bring your heart to it, and that will make a difference in how it turns out.
Do you have any sort of like exercises or ways that you work with creative hopelessness that you find particularly helpful with this type of clients?
Um, I think I do a lot of sort of the more standard ways, and I'm also willing to do things that are more subtle and over time. So there's the typical kinds of exercises like tell me everything you've tried to make this go away, and how have those things unfolded? Has it actually made them go away? And you can spend a lot of time in that space, entire session. I've used some metaphors, like the finger trap metaphor, where the harder you try to get out, the tighter it gets. But probably the way I like doing it the most is in a natural flowing conversation. And tell me more about what happened when you tried that, and where did it lead you? How long did it work? Um, how did it stop working? Right. So it's got this sort of quality of something that feels like a more natural conversation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then another question that we had, which also you talked about it a little bit. I mean, being a therapist is very hard. Working with trauma is no exception to that. You have to listen to some really tough stories and tough experiences. How do you kind of like take care of yourself as a therapist and also avoid secondary trauma? And for those in the audience who might not have heard that term, could you just like elaborate a bit on that term as well?
Yeah, so there's actually three terms that get used quite a bit in this territory: burnout, um, vicarious traumatization, and secondary trauma. And essentially, each of these are about a sense of, maybe loss of empathy, or feeling tired and worn out by doing the work. That could be part of it. But with the secondary trauma, vicarious trauma, part of what you'll see is um, clinicians who start to have post-trauma symptoms based on what they're hearing from their clients, right? So they're hearing the stories of their clients in ways that are impacting them in a negative fashion. And an example that I have is a therapist who was working with a woman who had been grabbed off the side of the road into a car and driven away and raped. And one of the things that she told the therapist was that when she was pulled off the road, one of her shoes uh, uh, was fell off and was on the side of the road. And so now, whenever she sees a shoe on the road, she thinks to herself, "Who's being raped?" Right? So it's just that, through relational framing that we make all these relationships. And she said that that really bothered her. So that's a small example of ways that people can be impacted by doing the work. And then, of course, there's larger examples where people really feel drawn in and start feeling um, anxious, fearful. There's even places where therapists can start to feel like the world is dangerous themselves. So when you keep hearing story after story after story, you can get into a place where if you start to fuse with the stories and you start to get attached where, there's nobody safe here, or that, there's wars, there's sexual assault, there's domestic violence, there's, all these different forms of trauma. And you hear all those and you can start to wonder, like, maybe the world isn't the best place. So, if you're starting to experience those things, one of the best things you can do is get consultation. But there's research that shows that consult with your colleagues, get support, get more training. So training and consultation are the two best antidotes for that kind of, to help prevent that kind of experience. Or if you're starting to experience it, seek support, and then maybe, slow down a little bit and spread your trauma clients out a little bit. Like, there's different ways that you can work to help yourself, and then use ACT with yourself.
Yeah. So like a short summary would be like, for those listening here, remember to take care of yourself. This is hard work, and acknowledge that it's a thing like secondary trauma. And as we would tell our clients, remember that also that you get some help, you get some training, and you get some support as well.
Yeah. And to not isolate around it, because that's where things can really kind of take off and grow. You want to reach out and talk with a colleague, or get consultation and help guide you. It can really make a big difference.
Yeah. And then another question that we had is, in ACT, how does ACT kind of like relate to, or how do we work with the trauma? Just to give you a little bit of content around this question, many ACT therapists have heard that at ACT we don't go into content, which means we don't really we are aware and not listening too much to the client's story. So how would we work with this in trauma, or like the specific incident in ACT? Does the question make sense?
Yeah. So you do want to hear the content of people's stories, but you want to understand the function of those stories, right? And how are these playing out in the person's life? And if you're being more process oriented during your sessions, that you might not attend directly to what they're saying, but looking at the function of what they're saying. And so with trauma, part of what you can find is that if you're not contacting emotions, if you're avoiding, if you're saying the story very quickly, or it's just, I was raped, and you don't say anything else, then you don't allow yourself the opportunity to work through the emotional and sensation experience of it. It doesn't get digested, so to speak, if I can use that term. And so when you talk about the content of the story, doing an exposure inside of ACT, basically, which is, ACT is exposure. We're inviting people to show up to their emotion and sensation experience, their mind experience. Then we want people to contact it, but not just with their head as a story, but as a whole body experience. And so we absolutely have to hear the story. The story is evocative. It elicits the emotional process, and you get people to slow down and to repeat the story, get connected to it. And, you got to get the right conditions in place, but, and you're very specifically listening to the content of it, but you want it to be connected to the whole experience, sensation, emotion, not just a story that's sort of played out over and over again. I can think of a quick example to share that would help sort it out a little bit. So I worked with a client who, his story was Vietnam ruined me and the government screwed me. It's a terrible time in Vietnam, lots of trauma. He's a Vietnam era veteran, and then came home and was told to take off his soldier's outfit and just disappear, grow your hair long and disappear into the crowd. Don't tell anybody you were in Vietnam, because there were such huge protests against the war and that kind of thing. And so he really struggled. He started using heroin, and 20 years later sought help at the VA again. And this is where I met him. And he'd been through, when we were doing creative hopelessness work, I asked him a little bit about his experience of psychotherapy. And he probably had 12 different therapists by the time he got to me. And years and years and years of psychotherapy. And what he was sharing with me is Vietnam ruined me and the government screwed me. Like the story was still the same story. Makes sense, but it was still the thing that was keeping him stuck. And so part of what I could have done as a therapist is validated that, which I did do, right? That's was part of the creative hopelessness work. That happened. Didn't deny that happened. That content is true. As a matter of these events unfolded. But then I also asked, how many times have you told this story? And without number, I told it thousands of times. And so then you start to hear something different, right? Like the story and the content of that story isn't actually helping him to heal. And because if telling it were what the only thing he needed to do, then he should have been really healed by that time. And so I did ask him, like, what do you imagine will happen if you share it again with me here? And the answer was pretty clear, nothing. Like, so you can feel how the content of it isn't the issue. How is it functioning? And his attachment to the story was functioning to keep him stuck. Vietnam was never going to be different for him. And it was true. The government screwed him back then, and he wasn't going to get unscrewed by telling the story again. So then we were able to focus in on how is that content functioning, and what do we need to, diffuse from or unattach from here. in terms of the content, and help you process what happened and move forward. So I hope that's a good example of the kind of, when we say don't let the content fool you. Not that we don't listen to the content, but we want the content to be connected to processing, or to look at how it's working in the person's life.
Yeah, so we would work with exposure, especially like if avoid the avoidance behavior is getting in the way of values. But sometimes also, as you mentioned, like sometimes telling the story can become the problem in itself, or perhaps like being too attached to your trauma. Once again, you are more than just your trauma. That's probably when we try to kind of move a bit away from the incident.
Yeah. And it makes sense to me when people get stuck, right? Like they want to be safe. And so in that kind of paradoxical way, they're trying to control what happened so they can stay safe. But the more you try to control, the more you're in contact with it, the bigger it gets. So it has that kind of paradoxical quality inside of it. But that's true with, anything that you're trying not to have, not just a traumatic memory or a traumatic experience. And so it's like, how do we let go of trying to control the past? There's only one thing to do with the past, really, in my opinion, and that's to let it be. Because you can't do anything else, right? Like there's nothing else to be done with the past. I mean, you can learn from it, and hopefully, but what turns out that we don't often learn from our past, but we can learn from our past, but we can't change our past. And that's really where, I can't tell you the number of clients that have come into my door and say, make it go away, make it stop. Understandably so. Understandably so.
If we could, we would, but we can't.
Yeah.
And then, Robyn, another question we also had, like we, as mentioned before, we had quite a lot of questions and we have a limited time, but let's see, perhaps we'll do a version 2 of this at one point. But another question that we also had is, um, for instance, like this, you often see with people who has experienced like early sexual abuse or sexual trauma, that they experience a lot of like shame and self-criticism, especially evolving or around the incident. How would you work with clients who might experience those feelings?
Yeah, no, I think it's really interesting, right? Like something seems a little off here when you've been sexually abused and then you're the shameful one, right? It should be the abuser that is experiencing the shame. And so part of the way I think about this is that we are inside of, hundreds and hundreds of years of social systems that blame the victim. This is part of it. Like, if you think about, especially, I think this might be especially true for women, where, what were you wearing? What did you do? Right? Like, even for younger women as well. Now, not the same for when you're children, like you wouldn't understand those kinds of things, or you wouldn't say that about what was the child wearing or something like that. But that they still grow up with the ideas that sexual abuse is problematic, and how did you participate or something like that. So there's a social quality to it that needs to be addressed and changed. And I'll tell clients, like, you were taught this and it's not your fault that this happened, and the shame doesn't belong with you. I understand that you feel it, but it doesn't belong with you. It's not yours to own in terms of attachment to it, but I understand why you have it. And then I think that you can get into these places where just even the notions of maybe I should have been able to do something about it. Like very young kids will feel like somehow they should have been able to make it stop. And so they'll take on a responsibility for it that isn't actually theirs. And these two are similar in nature, but one is about social learning and Of course, the other one's about learning too, but it's an idea that I have more power than I have. And so when I'm working with shame, I want to explore like the emotion and where it comes from, and how it how it shows up in the world. And I think even just talking about it can be hard because the world has a very, as should be, right? Because this is damaging, but it can get mixed up and twisted around in ways that suddenly it's the victim's fault. Or in the military, for instance, men are sexually assaulted more than women are. And that's because there's just more men than women, generally speaking, but men are sexually assaulted. And because of the social stigma around that, it's very hard for men to tell about those experiences. And they feel shame about it. Like, I should have been able to do something about this. Or how could this have ever happened to me? Like, what is it about me that this came my way, right? And so it's built into a lot of trauma in terms of what people experience. And the thing that I want to do when I'm working with it is let's go meet the shame and let's see what's in it, and what's the story about it, and what's the experience of it, and how does it push you around in your life, and can we allow it, not grow it, and have you step forward in ways that are healthy and not driven by shame and criticism. And that can take a fair bit of work and time. It's a pretty powerful emotion.
Yeah, so for those listening, be patient working with shame. And it can take time working with clients when they experience all of this.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And I think also this is also an exercise that you taught me. I mean, sometimes like if you have clients who experience, for instance, like sexual assault when they were like 6, 7, or 8 years old, sometimes telling them, try and go spend time with someone who's like 7 or 8 years old and see like how their minds are working. Would you blame that little boy or girl for whatever happened? But for some reason, you kind of do it towards yourself.
Yeah, yeah.
But that perspective taking sometimes can be very, very helpful. I mean, we'll never make the shame go away, but we can relate to it differently.
Yeah, part of what happens is, your older mind, like your 30 or 40-year-old mind, is looking back at that young kid and putting what you know now on top of them. And so that contact with a 6-year-old can remind you, like, these guys are not very sophisticated, right? Like, they're not moving around in the world in a way that we are when we're older and more sophisticated in our thinking. And it'd be really useful to remember what it was like to be 6 and innocent.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then, Robyn, some of the other questions, these are a bit more like a personal note. Um, so but it's more like for the listeners or viewers to get a chance to get to know you a little bit better. So working with ACT for so long, it might be hard for you to remember. But when you were, for instance, like young and inexperienced as a therapist, new to ACT, what did you find was the hardest part or the most difficult part about ACT to learn?
An interesting question, because in that first workshop that I did, I don't know if people have ever had this experience. Maybe you have more and you can share if you do, but it's like a puzzle. It was like a puzzle where lots of pieces missing. And in that workshop, it all went like all the puzzle pieces just fell into place. And so like something struck me. And I think that happens for a lot of people when they go to these workshops. As in translating it out into the world, I think that can be challenging for folks. And I think for me, it's more, how do how do I bring this into the therapy room as a model that in a way that the client can join me in the puzzle pieces falling in. And so it's not parts of the model per se, but that helping people connect to it in a way where they get that freedom, it can sometimes be challenging. Translating the model, I suppose,
Yeah.
is a good way to say it.
Yeah, I think if I understand you correctly, I think this is also what I remember, or I think many, you kind of like understand ACT at an intellectual level.
Mhm.
ACT is like an experience therapy, and it is in like when we kind of like feel it or we experience it, that's where the true power is. I also found it super, super tricky, and it has taken me a long time to learn it. I'm still learning how to actually be fluid in ACT, how to kind of like fluid and natural within all the different processes that we have,
Yeah,
instead of not doing it as a technique.
yeah. I guess RFT was hard.
Yeah, RFT is hard. Yeah, definitely.
I remember, I think I've shared this story with you before, Martin, but I remember asking Steve when I was learning RFT, to uh, explain it to me like I was a 5-year-old child. I said, just like, treat me like I'm 5 and tell me what this is. And he started talking, and I interrupted him after a few minutes and said, Steve, like I'm 5. I'm still not understanding. And he said, I am talking to you like you're a 5-year-old. And I was like, oh, then go to 2. Let's go to 2.
I imagine that that might be a bit of a, let's call it a humbling experience.
Yes, yes. So
Yeah.
that, if you know, that was probably the more challenging part of the theory anyway, of thinking about RFT, relational frame theory, and how that
Yeah.
how that relates to what we're doing.
What would you, if you could give one piece of advice to your younger self,
Mhm.
you can choose if it's like as a young therapist or just like on a personal level. What advice would you like to give yourself?
Um, that's a good question. I think to act more in the face of the fears or little anxieties that you had, right? That to not be so worried about the evaluation that's coming your way. I think I mentioned that Steve used to watch us through a one-way mirror, and
Um, that has been terrifying.
yeah, and so right, it'd be like he'd tap on the window and pull you out of the session, and he'd brainstorm about what to do with the client, and we'd watch videotapes of ourselves doing the therapy, and the amount of evaluation and fear of evaluation that shows up there is pretty heavy. And not that you wouldn't feel those things. I mean, it makes sense, of course, but that I didn't get so caught up in it, because it just ultimately didn't matter. Yeah, it
Yeah.
was better for the feedback and for the work that happened. Yeah.
And what is one piece of advice that you would give to everybody listening right now who might be struggling perhaps with something in their personal life, struggling with something as a therapist? What is one piece of advice that you would like to tell them?
Well, I think given that I'm sort of um, really keen on selfless context and meaning, it would be to, recognize that you're here and you're conscious. You are not the momentary experience that rises and falls. And that what is really important is where you put your feet. And so, you know, bringing your a meaning alive, and um, connecting with people, and all those things that feel important to you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Connect with people,
Yeah.
connect with the things that are important to you, and you won't feel like this forever.
It just, things don't last forever. Emotions rise and fall, and experiences come and go. And yes, of course, we remember things, but that memory rises and falls. And So if we can really connect to the fluidity of our experience and that we're here, like this is kind of a fascinating thing, right? We're here and we're conscious, we're aware that we're here. And so you can spend your consciousness sort of looking at the past and trying to get rid of something that's going to pass if you allow it to rise and fall, or you can spend your time connecting to what you care about. And my wish is, my hope is that people will do the latter.
Connect to the things that you care about. Spend your time connecting with things that you care about.
Yeah.
That's a good piece of advice. Robyn, thank you so much for being with me on the show, being the first one on Ask the Experts. I will link to your website where people can read more about you. They can reach out if they have any questions. They can read about your books, and
Yes.
if they're interested, they can buy the new one, You Are Not Your Trauma. Thank you so much for being here, Robyn, and have a nice weekend.
Thanks for having me, Martin. Good luck with
Bye.
your series.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye bye.